Thank you, Calvin and Hunter College, for having me today. It's wonderful to be here in New York again. The first time in a few years that I've been able to come back to New York City. Today, I'm going to be talking about my book, Trying to Make It, which has been out for about 2 months now. It's a story that I think is a very American story. It's the reason why I gave it this title, Trying to Make It, because to me, that is a sentiment that many Americans share, regardless of where you're from, where you were born, whether you're a foreign national coming to the United States, whether you were born here. We have this idea that we're going to make it someday. We're going to do better than our parents. And, what that looks like changes, but, it's a sentiment that we all seem to share. Now, in this context, I'm talking about the drug trade. And I guess starting with that thought, how do we think about the drug trade? I think a lot of times we think about it based on the communities that we grow up in. So I grew up in this community, Springfield, Illinois. It's the state capital. It's kind of a rural place. We see lots of cornfields and lots of soybean fields. These photographs were taken outside from the house that I grew up in. Now, in a lot of these fields, we have these giant tanks of anhydrous ammonia. And you might be asking yourself, what does this have to do with drugs? But anhydrous ammonia is a really important part of this story. Anhydrous ammonia is a chemical compound which is used to re-nitrogenate the soil in these farming areas, right? Because when you grow a lot of corn or a lot of soybeans, you use a lot of the nutrients in the ground. So the ammonia re-nitrogenates the soil so you can keep growing season after season the corn and the soybeans. It's also a key component in terms of creating an amphetamine called crank. Now, this is a cheap amphetamine which people in Middle America sometimes abuse. When I was growing up, I heard stories of men going to these tanks and trying to steal anhydrous ammonia in order to make crank. They would often mess up and burn the heck out of themselves. Now, I guess that's not really the story of the drug trade that I'm going to get to today, but that's my starting point, along with a lot of the starting points that many people in the US might have in terms of the drug trade. We watch a lot of fiction, right? We see representations like The Wire, Narcos, or Breaking Bad. Now, The Wire in itself was a pretty good representation of the drug trade. I like to mention to a lot of my students that season 1 is a good representation of how the drug trade functioned in Baltimore in terms of the connections made, the technologies used, and the social dynamics of it. But a lot of times we see other shows which color the way that we think about the drug trade, like Breaking Bad. I like to joke that if Breaking Bad was keeping it real, then in episode 2, there'd be some 16-year-old kid with an Uzi who would rock up to Walter White's house and shoot his whole family, and the show would be over, right? We also see representations of these kingpins. We like to see all of the glitz and glamour that they were able to have in their lives. So we see shows like Narcos. This is the type of thing that tends to govern the way that we think about the drug trade. And in addition to this, of course, we have the talking heads, right, that we see on various news programs. Certainly, we see narratives that talk about all of the threats that people who are part of the drug trade have on America. And this is really what underwrote my research in terms of looking at the drug trade in the US. So I decided to go to the border. In El Paso and Ciudad Juarez, I went to Phoenix, which 10 years ago had this narrative that there were a lot of kidnappings which were associated with the drug trade. And then I finally ended my research in Chicago, which has never left the news and is a very prominent whipping boy in terms of what is wrong with America. So I started my research and I decided to get this Ford F-150. It's an important part of the story because it allowed me to be invisible, right? When doing this kind of work, I think it's really important to try to blend in. And I have certain advantages, right? I have this ethnic ambiguity where people can't really place where I'm from. I could be from anywhere. And the F-150 kind of helped with that as well, right? Because the F-150 is the most commonly sold and used vehicle in the United States. So you're going to see F-150s in all sorts of neighborhoods. No one's ever going to wonder what the heck an F-150 is doing in their neighborhood. It's just a vehicle that somebody in their neighborhood has. It's extremely popular. So I had this truck and I decided to drive to the border in order to try to unpack what the drug trade looked like. It seemed like an impossible task, right? As the come and go sign put there. So I found that to be quite amusing. Now, certainly As I drove to the border, I saw images like this out of my window, right? And this is the kind of image that I think a lot of times we associate with the drug trade. It kind of looks like the border, the desert. But the truth of the matter is that this has nothing to do with drug trafficking, right? You don't see individuals muling drugs on their back with backpacks or little carts or whatever, crossing the desert in the middle of nowhere, Texas-Mexico border, right? That's just not how it's happening. So anyway, these scenes were very common as I drove towards El Paso. I took a rest at the Sands Motel. It's certainly not as glamorous as the Sands in Vegas, but still, it had a steakhouse, it had free Wi-Fi. What more do you actually need? I eventually got to the Paso del Norte. The Paso del Norte is a metropolitan area that consists of two cities that really ebb and flow. In the background, we see Ciudad Juarez, right? You can see that it is a massive, sprawling place. There's about 1 million people who live there, maybe more. On the foreground, we see El Paso, right, where you have the downtown. It's more built up. The houses are a bit bigger. The border is visually distinct here in this image, right? You can see right behind the buildings of downtown that the border is right there. In the background, you see a message which was written by an evangelical Christian organization that says, "The Bible is the truth, read it." And funnily enough, when I was in El Paso in 2014, that organization was trying to put another message up. And the people of Juarez were just like, "Listen, we understand what our faults are. We have the message, enough with it." And they put the kibosh on that. Now, I started my investigation in terms of how the drug trade works in the United States by going to immigration court. Now, why did I start there? Well, because there were so many talking heads that were talking about all of these unauthorized immigrants, the illegal immigrants who were involved with the drug trade. And I thought, okay, let's test the claims that we hear in the media. Okay. And I went to immigration court, and I went to a lot of different immigration courts. I went to detained and non-detained dockets in El Paso. I saw courts in San Antonio. I saw courts in Phoenix. I went to Eloy, Arizona, which is a court that processes individuals who have been convicted of crimes. I also went to courts in Denver, which had a higher proportion of unaccompanied minors who were being processed through the courts there. And I saw probably 400 different cases if I had to estimate off the top of my head. Now, one of the things that was true is that I hardly ever heard about the drug trade in terms of the people being participants in it as their cases were being processed through the immigration courts. I heard about the drug trade for individuals who were seeking relief from removal time and again, particularly in the border areas. They would tell stories of criminal organizations coming, threatening them with violence. And they had come to the United States seeking asylum. Now, the vast majority of these individuals would not be granted asylum. And that's not because what they said wasn't true. That's because they hadn't met the threshold to receive asylum. One of the conditions that's commonly used to determine whether or not somebody is eligible for asylum is that they have tried to displace themselves within their own countries first. So they have violence, they go to another place, and then they experience the same threat because that establishes a pattern that they can't be safe in their country. Many individuals come to the United States without having displaced themselves first. But it kind of makes sense, right? If somebody threatens to kill you, are you just going to go somewhere else? Certainly we have that old adage, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, and you're dead. So they're not actually going to try to displace in Mexico because they view the threat as being something that creates credible fear on their personal safety. So it's really hard to judge the asylum rate as an indicator of truthfulness of what individuals are reporting in immigration court. It's certainly not that. So after having listened to many, many cases, I heard one or two stories of individuals who were involved in the drug trade, but they were low-level people. There was a guy who was being deported, and he didn't have any options for release. He had sold, some marijuana and some amount of pills that would be considered kind of a retail quantity in Kansas. He spoke with this perfect Midwestern accent. He wasn't anybody who you would think was not an American, the way that he carried himself, the way that he spoke, right? But, he was born in Mexico, and because he had this felony charge, he was subject to removal. I heard another story of a man who was a quote unquote reason to believe drug trafficker. Now, this individual was interesting in the sense that he was in a non-detained docket setting. What does that mean? It meant that an immigration judge had heard his case and had decided that there was enough reason to grant him bond and allow him to be a participating member of American society while he waited for his case to go through the immigration court process. To me, that's a really unusual set of circumstances, right? Why would somebody who has a reason to believe drug trafficker label affixed to their case be allowed to go into the community? What that says to me is that the evidence was pretty weak at some point in time. So without finding out too much in immigration court, I decided to cross the border. Now, this is a photograph of what Juarez looked like in 2014 when I was there. Now, Juarez is completely different today, right? You don't see all of these broken walls in the downtown. In fact, the downtown was completely refurbished. I went back in 2009 to check it out, and the entire downtown was whitewashed. It was really pretty. It was well lit, and the hotels had been completely refurbished. Now, what was going on there was something that was quite interesting, and it was a byproduct of the Trump administration's rule that people had to stay in Mexico to wait for their cases. We saw some really sad things like tent cities where you had impoverished individuals who were camping up along the border waiting their turn for a court hearing. But then we also saw another set of migrants who were predominantly Cuban who were waiting in Juarez. And what was happening is that their families and their social circles were sending them money to be able to set up shop in Juarez so their lives would be comfortable as they waited for their asylum hearings. So you saw all of these hotels, which had been previously used primarily for sex workers to serve their clients, be refurbished. The lights had been fixed. You saw Cuban restaurants and salsa was played on the street, so you could hear that music in a lot of contrast to what you heard before. Now, Ciudad Juarez has a long history of smuggling, right? One of the stories that I would hear from time and again was the story of how alcohol would be smuggled from Mexico into the United States. This image is of the famous Kentucky Club. Now, this place is famous because it invented the margarita, right? Delicious drink that we're all familiar with. Now, it is also a place where apparently, according to the journalist who I interviewed, was a location where smugglers would meet in order to be able to, gather their products and establish their smuggling operations across to the United States in the time of Prohibition. So this bar has been there for a long time. I guess the neon lights are relatively new. Now, certainly Juarez is a very ordinary city, right? In the time that I went, there was a lull in the violence. Now, it's true that there was a lot of violence there. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. But walking around Juarez, we see that it's actually a land of opportunity. It's one of the most expensive cities to live in Mexico. It's a place where people can earn higher rents for all of their activities. Even these indigenous women who had migrated from somewhere else in Mexico were finding opportunity by selling their goods on the street here. They would probably use the money to keep themselves alive, but also remit some money back to their families. We saw all sorts of maquilas. Now, these are factories, right? And certainly if you were in a vehicle today or used an electronic device today, probably a component in something that you've touched today was assembled along the border, right? Using relatively inexpensive labor compared to what that labor would cost in the United States. All of these factories are along the border because once the components are assembled, then it's a very short ride to truck it into the American market. Now, it's also an opportunity for the drug trade. Now, this man here was paraded by these journalists. It's a thing that they did, the perp walk. Anytime somebody would be captured and accused of being part of the drug trade, that individual would be paraded in front of these journalists. And here we see television journalists, and I was accompanying a newsprint journalist to this event. Now, this man doesn't look like the stereotypical drug kingpin that we've become accustomed to seeing in television, right? He looks like a man who works on a construction site. He's got a high-vis vest on, and on the table in front of him are a bunch of power tools. What's he being accused of? He's being accused of modifying vehicles to have secret compartments to transit bricks of heroin, cocaine, or methamphetamines across the border. Now, he's a good example in terms of how the drug trade actually works, right? The drug trade is a series of enterprises which are connected through other individuals who handle logistics. This man off the street would have changed very, very little in terms of how the drug trade operates. There would have been dozens, maybe even hundreds like him who had the skills to be able to modify these vehicles. Taking him off the street would have maybe put a damper in some short-term operations, but there would have been somebody able and willing to take up the mantle to modify vehicles, right? He does not represent the kinds of threats that have come into the public imagery when we hear all of the discourse about crime and the drug trade, particularly in the United States. Certainly, the violence in Juarez related to the drug trade is very real. In 2013, the year before I did this research, Ciudad Juarez was the most violent city in the world that wasn't in an active war zone, which is something that is, mind-boggling. It completely changed the dynamics of the city. I was talking to individuals who lived in El Paso. Now, keep in mind that people who lived in El Paso often had transnational families. They were born or maybe had parents or grandparents who were born in Juarez and still lived there, had links to the places there. And you talk to individuals who lived in Ciudad Juarez at the turn of the century, and they talked about it being a vibrant place where people from El Paso would come across the border and go out, spend their money, party in these kinds of clubs. And certainly people in El Paso told the exact same story, right? It's a transnational community, which is separated with the fence, but has a tremendous flow back and forth every day, even to this day. But we would see nightclubs like this completely abandoned, boarded up. And the nightclubs that were open were completely empty. Spaces for young people were still scary spaces. A lot of young people didn't want to go out because they were afraid that they were going to encounter individuals who would engage in violence with them. That was a very real and very credible fear. But what was happening in Ciudad Juarez was some kind of rebound, right? We saw spaces that catered to families coming back to life. So this little fun fair here was a permanent fixture of Ciudad Juarez, right? You would drive around these areas and you would see families out, right? Parents with their children having a good time. You would see kids playing baseball. If you went to restaurants, sometimes you would see them completely packed and they would have musicians there performing for everyone to enjoy. And you would see singing and dancing and people having a few drinks, and it was extremely lively. These places seemed to be off limits in terms of individuals who were involved in the drug trade. There was an understanding that there needed to be some compartmentalization in terms of where the violence was. Shooting up a family type event was going to get them nothing. It was just going to ensure that individuals would resent them. And certainly one of the things that is true is that even in a place as violent as Juarez, criminal entrepreneurs understand that there is a balance in terms of how violence works to be able to control spaces. Now, other opportunities also exist that are around the drug trade. Here we see a Casa de Cambio, a place where you go and exchange money, right? They are peppered all across the border, on both sides of the border. One thing that's true is that there is a tremendous amount of cash that is held in locations like this and banks on the US side of the border, because money does flow right across the border in a very real and physical sense. These are also places where money launderers are able to develop stories where the money comes from, right? If you think about money laundering at its essence is about crafting a story that is associated with some money that says this money has come from a place that we can say is appropriate for where it came from, and it is going somewhere else that we can now spend it on illicit items. That is the basic idea of money laundering. And we see all types of schemes and various means to be able to launder money. One such example are these types of houses. Now, these houses are built for individuals who are coming from elsewhere in Mexico to work in the maquilas. These are very modest dwellings. It's concrete structure that might have 1 or 2 rooms in it. Now, some of them are completed, like the house on the left, but many are abandoned. You will see entire neighborhoods of partially constructed houses like this. And the individuals who I talked with in Mexico were talking about how these were part of elaborate schemes to be able to launder money. Certainly, we see these types of examples elsewhere in the world where you have multiple companies that are controlled or associated with criminal interests that are engaging in practices that that help them hide the audit trail of where the money is going, right? They might overbill for particular supplies. They might pay for labor that never actually existed. And they say, well, we had problems, because who doesn't when building something? I learned what I could at the border, right? And certainly in Ciudad Juarez, I was realistic in terms of what I could potentially learn. I talked to journalists, I talked to harm reduction workers, and I talked to academics. And they certainly had good insights because they were of the community. I was able to learn a tremendous amount in terms of how the old days worked because a lot of these individuals had been participants in the case of harm reduction workers or had family members affected by the drug trade in their entire lives. But I decided that in order to really understand what I was looking after, which was how does the drug trade work in the United States, I needed to go back to El Paso. And so I crossed the border again. Here we can see that the river is not really a river. It's not, grand, but there it is. That's separating the US from Mexico. X marks Mexico. Here we see a very clear separation of the US and Mexico, with the US part of the bridge being to the left and Mexico being to the right. This is a view of the border as you come back into the United States. And this is a view which is beautiful to the eyes of traffickers. Why? Because it's busy. And they understand that there are certain risk profiles that exist when places are very busy. So why is this good for a trafficker? Well, they understand that not all of these vehicles can be searched by customs at the border. In fact, a very small proportion of these vehicles can be searched. If every single vehicle at the border was searched, traffic would be backed up to Mexico City within 7 days. So that's not going to happen, right? So we start to see that there is a lot of opportunity to actually engage in the drug trade. One of the things that was true that I learned about the drug trade in El Paso is that those who wanted to become involved with the drug trade were never too far away from being involved. Most people had no business with the drug trade, but those who wanted to find it could because somebody in their social network was involved. Now, I lived in El Paso in a house that's on the corner of this block, and right across the street from me was an individual who had a trap house, right? A place where individuals would drive up and buy drugs. A lot of the drugs selling, the retail sales were out of sight, out of mind, right? You didn't have the hand-to-hand sales that we read about or, that Biggie was rapping about, in the 90s, right? That certainly wasn't the way that the retail drug trade unfolded in El Paso. And it's something that was somewhat of a change. I took a former gang member on a drive. He had left El Paso, lived in the suburbs, and we were driving through, and he was just shocked that all of the old corners were completely dead. But the truth of the matter is that anything which is visible to everybody. And to reduce your risk, you make sure that it's invisible to most. And those who know are able to access these spaces. Now, I was limited in terms of accessing these spaces because I was still an outsider. Sure, my Spanish is fine and have this ethnic ambiguity, but who am I to walk through these areas? And I was kind of at a loss. I tapped on the shoulders of academics who were in the area to introduce me to people. And, they did what they could, but there was only, 2 or 3 real contacts that I was able to develop. So what did I do? I did the thing that a lot of young people do today, right? I turned to Craigslist. Right? You find what? A mattress, maybe a used TV. And I found people who had done 3 to 5 in the penitentiary for a drug charge. In the context of El Paso, that meant that those individuals were most likely charged with the trafficking offense. So individuals with that profile came to see me. The University of Texas in El Paso very graciously had me as a visiting student and gave me office space. So, I had people who were calling me up from my Craigslist ad, and they showed up and they started to tell me what they knew about the drug trade. And this is really what shaped how my research looked. One of the very first people who I interviewed was a man who was part of the Barrio Azteca prison gang, which was the most significant prison gang in the area on both sides of the border. And his point to me was a very simple point. He said, you have to stop asking the questions that you're asking and ask a different set of questions. The question is not about the drug cartels in America. They don't have any real role here. The question is, who is facilitating distribution in the United States? In El Paso, that was Barrio Azteca. They had their fingers everywhere. They were connected to the logistics firms in Mexico, the so-called drug cartels, but it was Barrio Azteca and other actors who were moving the wholesale quantities of drugs across the border. That approach revolutionized the way that I thought about the drug trade and put me on the path to understanding the dynamics and writing the book that I'm talking about today. Well, I spoke to various gang members in El Paso, and I learned about the way that the wholesale trade works in El Paso and the retail trade works in El Paso. And at a certain point, I stopped hearing news stories. So I thought it was time to get a move on. So I got into my car and I drove west towards Phoenix. Beautiful place if you haven't seen it, right? I get to Phoenix, and Phoenix is quite different. It's something like 3.5 hours north from the border. And the types of communities that you have in Phoenix are different in terms of not having that transnational element to the same extent. So we start finding individuals who are less connected to the drug trade. What does that mean? It means that they're more reliant on finding somebody who is connected. So whereas most retailers had a very clear path to finding a wholesaler in El Paso, that was less true in Phoenix, right? So Phoenix was this place that had a tremendous amount of visible use on the streets. It was a place that had this massive narrative in terms of crime. Certainly in 2014, when the elections were happening, we had all of the same narratives that we hear today. Crime is a problem. We have these drug traffickers who are taking over our city, and certainly the politicians who were barracking on the street were talking about how their conservative bona fides were the best conservative bona fides, with really silly ways to measure that by things like, my opponent shook Obama's hand. Shouldn't have, because that's not the mark of a true conservative. So some things don't really change. Like I said, there was a very visual element in terms of the drug trade in Phoenix, right? There were certainly a large number of people who had mental health issues, substance abuse problems, and there were some services like CAST that tended to these individuals. But I was far more likely to walk around downtown Phoenix and encounter individuals who were using or who were high on the streets than I was in El Paso. It was just a very different dynamic, and that was for sure. Okay, maybe one reason is that there's just more money in Phoenix, right? So people feel like that there are different sets of opportunities that are available. But in Phoenix, it was, you know, more common to find the hand-to-hand types of trafficking, that retail sales that that we're accustomed to hearing about in public. But Phoenix is also a place where there's a tremendous wholesale trade, right? So we see Phoenix as a place that that has organizations stage drugs. Now, staging drugs means holding it into a location and then moving it on in terms of the supply chain, right? So when a set of drugs is staged, we started to see rip crews in Phoenix. They would try to find out where these logistics firms were keeping all of these drugs. And this was the reason why we had the kidnapping scare of 2013 or whatever it was, right? So you had these rip crews going into these houses, stealing all of these drugs, and they would just tie everybody up who was in the house. Now, that constitutes kidnapping, right? Kidnapping is not necessarily taking somebody out of their house, but it's immobilizing them against their will. So what would happen is sometimes these crews would get it wrong. They'd break into a house, they tie everybody up, oops, there's nothing there, and then they would leave, right? So that's exactly what was happening. Certainly in Phoenix, these dynamics were not there when I was doing my research. Outside of Phoenix is a little community called Guadalupe. Now, Guadalupe is an interesting place, right? It's a very impoverished community. Sometimes the problems that we see with poverty are amplified, you know, in communities like this. You had a high school graduation rate that sometimes was in the single digits in this community. You had individuals who had migrated to this community from Mexico who did have connections to drug trafficking organizations. Now, we're talking about individuals who today, if they were still alive, would be in their 90s, right? And they established these kinds of links. Now, their children became members of gangs, and the street gangs would go into the prison system, and then they would join with the prison gangs that we saw in the prison system. Now, this was a very similar kind of thing that was happening along the border, and the prison gangs in both Texas and in Phoenix and Arizona had a lot of business interests. Why is that important? Because with those business interests, they also made rules to keep their businesses safe. What does that mean? It means that they don't want to see violence on the street, because when you have violence on the street, you get the heat coming to check you out. And that's always bad for business. So in this community, you had some members of the Mexican mafia, right? And this was a prison gang that dominated the prison gangs in Arizona, not to be confused with the Mexican mafia in California or Texas. You know, I guess sometimes gang members aren't that creative in terms of their naming. Now, I got burgled while I was living in Phoenix. I was volunteering in Guadalupe, and somebody was cased my house in my neighborhood and saw that me and the roommate were gone and busted down the door and then tossed the place. My landlords had put NRA stickers on our house to scare people off, but what that was a like hit me flag because people were looking for guns to be able to do things. So this happened, and I went back to work, and I was really bummed out. The woman to the right here, Adelita, was, a very sensitive person. She had the ability to look at an individual and really understand that they were having a bad day. And, as I was volunteering, she turns to me and she says, "Mijo, what happened?" And so I explained to her what happened, that, somebody broke into my house and stolen everything, right? I was extremely unlucky. I had duplicates of everything, but I had just come back from a trip. So everything was in my house on that occasion. I hadn't yet gone back to the office to split everything up. So I lost everything. And, Adelita had spent 20 years of her life in prison. When she was 18 years old, she took the rap for a boyfriend so he wouldn't have 3 strikes, And a lot of people judge folks, but, I just point out that when we're young, we do a lot of things that are stupid that feel like we're in love, right? Like, how many of us have gone through this situation where you go and you defend somebody who you think you're in love with and they turn out to be a real jerk? I think that happens to most of us, right? So in any event, this was the beginning of her entire adulthood, which was mainly spent incarcerated. She would go back out into the community, but because she was hooked on heroin and never received the support to get off the drug, she kept relapsing, peeing dirty, and then being sent back to prison, this revolving door. She spent so much time in prison that she rose through the ranks. She was the top female inmate in terms of the prison society that was there. She was a great manager. In another life, she would have been able to do all sorts of good things like conflict resolution. She was able to ensure that she got the best out of the women who were there. She de-escalated situations. She tried to ensure that violence wouldn't happen. She also lived by a credo, and that credo was that people who were not involved with the trade, with gangs, they had no business being impacted by the things that were happening in that world. In 2019, she saw a group of people robbing somebody in her community at gunpoint. Now, you have to imagine what this was like for her. She would have had a phone on her, but she would have really struggled to use that phone. It wasn't a priority. She spent 20 years in prison, and when she got the phone, I remember her showing it to me. She was amazed at Facebook connecting her to all of these people who she hadn't seen for years. Now, when she saw this individual being robbed, rather than call the police, she went and she interfered. She put her body in between that individual and the people who were robbing, and the robbers shot her. She died from her wounds. It was one of the bravest things that I've ever heard somebody do, and it's something that I think exemplifies one of the missions that I had in this book, which was to show the very basic human nature of most people, regardless of the choices that they make that might get them incarcerated in their lifetime. I would not have been as brave as her to be able to go and to put an end to that robbery. She wouldn't have known this, but those robbers had hit 5 people in that whole day. The 5th stop was hers. They'd already killed a person over his backpack earlier in the day. Her actions saved that person's life. I didn't know this at the time of writing the book, but she actually survived her wounds initially. She went to the hospital and she didn't get care. They let her check herself out, and she died at home. I found out that she was dead when I went to go wish her happy birthday, and there were photographs of her funeral posted all over Facebook. She was buried at this church that's in Guadalupe. After Phoenix, I drove north. And I stopped in Nebraska to meet this man, Jose Rivera. Now, Jose was a man who founded Barrio Azteca back in the 1980s. His mission wasn't to start a prison gang that was going to become this massive criminal enterprise. His mission was to try to establish an inmate organization that had a little bit of solidarity. So people from El Paso and from Juarez didn't have to worry about getting beat up by the other more established prison gangs that drew from the rest of the state. He was successful in this mission, right? He was able to get the people from the Paso del Norte who were incarcerated with him to join together. And this was the beginning of Barrio Azteca. It was an inmate solidarity group. Now, Jose never became a kingpin. He was never a high-level drug trafficker or anything of the like. He just had a little bit of charisma back in the day. And he went out and he continued to, have a life of petty crime until he decided enough was enough. For him, he left El Paso. That was the way that he was able to get off of engaging in criminal activities. He moved to the Midwest and he lived there for the rest of his life doing legitimate jobs, driving trucks, roofing. And like most Americans, he died with no health insurance and a ton of health problems. I continued to Chicago, which is the last stop of this journey. Now, Chicago is a place that has a lot of diversity, right? We see that Chicago is a city that has the glitz and glamour of this photograph of the big buildings downtown. Of course, we have images like the Bean in the middle of winter, places which are iconic. But we also have neighborhoods which are impoverished in Chicago. In this neighborhood, we have a laundromat which is full of bullet holes. It was such a violent street corner that we saw, the police putting in cameras that showed them what was happening. These cameras don't have very good track records, right? All of what happened was the violence got displaced down the block. The man in the photograph is a violence interrupter. Now, for those of you who don't know, violence interrupters are formerly involved gang members who have been incarcerated and come out, and now they have this employment, which is where they are integrated into present iterations of their same gang, but they're trying to de-escalate problems. So if there is a violent action that happens, they're trying to ensure that there's not violent retaliation. And it has mixed results, but I'm sure that there are individuals who have not been killed by these de-escalation processes that the violence interrupters engage in. Now, in the neighborhoods, we would see places like this, right? Now, this place was a grow operation, or today we would call it kind of a dispensary, right? And certainly in Illinois, we have dispensaries, right? You can go and purchase cannabis on any street corner, like many states in the United States. So how far have we come in less than 10 years? Now, Chicago certainly has the dark side of the drug trade. A lot of people don't understand that Chicago is built on a platform. Downtown Chicago has a complete underground area to it. And you would see these tunnels before they were bricked off by the city being populated by individuals who didn't have homes. They would set up operations here and they would use. So Chicago certainly has a lot of the dark things that we see. There's certainly a degree of violence in Chicago that we wouldn't see in the American Southwest. And a lot of that had to do with the fact that the drug trade didn't run through prison gangs. Prison gangs didn't have the authority on the street to be able to say, hey, you're going to screw our business up. Don't engage in that violence. They didn't have the types of rules that they established like you would see in the American Southwest, where if somebody engaged in a drive-by shooting and they showed up in jail or in prison, they would be harmed by the prison gang, right? One thing is true. If you're involved in the life of crime, either you, somebody you care about, family member, and associate is going to get caught. And if you're doing something which is not condoned by the prison gang who's controlling the jails or the prison, then you're going to face some punishment when you get there. Now, the most important part of the story of Chicago is the story of the Flores twins. Now, today, the Flores twins have a podcast which is hosted by 50 Cent, actually, that's dropping, and they're telling their story. And the Flores twins were the most prolific drug traffickers that the US has ever seen. A lot of times folks like to think about drug cartels like the Sinaloa cartels or the Leyva brothers. But the truth of the matter is that in the United States, we see logistics companies like the Flores crew who are distributing drugs. Those drug cartels in Mexico are supplying individuals like the Flores twins to be the distributors in the United States. The Flores twins supplied America, which is not an exaggeration. They supplied over a dozen cities with very high quality product. When I talked to people on the street after the Flores twins surrendered some 15 years ago, they talked about the quality of the drugs that were on the street taking a nosedive. Interestingly enough, I had a correspondence with one of the Flores twins, and he was telling me that the quality of their product was important to them because they wanted to ensure that people weren't dying behind it. They refused to supply fentanyl to the market because they knew that it would kill people, as people didn't know how to use it safely. Now, the Flores twins surrendered when they were in their mid to late 20s. They surrendered because there was a credible threat of violence, but they also surrendered because they were tired of doing this. And this maps onto a lot of the life course kinds of stories that we see in the literature, right? People having children, they both had children, and they were tired of running and engaging in this life of crime. They surrendered and they worked with the US government. They testified in a number of trials. And these individuals who have been extradited from Mexico to the United States are now serving long sentences, some of them like Chapo Guzman, life sentences without the possibility of parole in Florence, Colorado. This is one of the only stories that I was not able to fully complete. While the Flores twins are out and free today, their wives are still under federal investigation, right? They're being tried. The government is trying to pin them on money laundering charges. This is highly unusual because generally speaking, in terms of cooperating witnesses, women are not prosecuted. Even individuals who are prosecuted, their wives are generally left out of the equation. The most notable example of this not happening was Emma Coronel. She was the first woman who went down for the involvement of her partner's drug trafficking organization. So what's happening in terms of the prosecution of Viviana Lopez and Valerie Gaitan is highly unusual. And it'll be interesting to see what effect that has in terms of people cooperating with the US government moving forward. So that is the story that I brought to life in my book. I hope that you've enjoyed my presentation. If you have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you so much, Calvin and Hunter Sociology, for having me today. I really appreciate the opportunity to present.